You are listening to the Fibromyalgia Podcast with Tami Stackelhouse, Episode 4. Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tami Stackelhouse. In this episode, I want to talk a little bit about what fibromyalgia is. Now, I realize that for many of you, this may actually be a little bit basic, but I thought it would be a good idea for us to all start on the same page. Now, next episode, in episode 5, I'm going to have Dr. Ginevra Lipton come and talk about what she believes fibromyalgia is from her perspective as a physician, as a researcher, and as a specialist. So in this episode, I'm just going to give you as a patient, as a coach, and just as a layman, so to speak, some of the background, some of the history, and what I believe about fibromyalgia. So first and foremost, I believe that there's a lot more that we don't know about fibromyalgia than we do know. Now, with fibromyalgia, I really believe, like I mentioned in episode 1, that it's like the elephant in the parable of the elephant and the blind men. We've got a lot of researchers who are seeing pieces of the puzzle, pieces of the fibromyalgia elephant, but there's a lot that we don't know. And so far, I haven't seen anything that ties all of those various pieces together. When somebody asks me what fibromyalgia is, I usually answer very simply, it's a chronic pain condition. I think that a lot of times people, it can be overwhelming to them if we start going into the in-depth story of what fibromyalgia is. But I think everybody can understand that it's chronic pain. Fibromyalgia does vary a lot from patient to patient, which is, I think, one of the challenges, is that we don't always look the same and we don't always respond in the same ways to treatments. So it can be challenging for doctors to diagnose, it can be challenging for doctors to treat because of that. As of today, as I record this in February 2019, we don't really know what causes it, and there is no cure. Now, I do believe that even though there is no cure, that there is a lot that can be done. And I believe you can get to the point where your fibromyalgia isn't really impacting your life, and you can live the life you want to live without fibromyalgia impacting that. Of course, it depends on a lot of things. I've talked about this in almost every episode. How much better you feel varies from person to person and can depend on a lot of things, from your resources to where you live to what other illnesses you might have, how long you've been diagnosed, and all of that. And so fibromyalgia, the question of what is fibromyalgia, is a complicated one to answer. I find that if somebody has a simple answer, it's most likely not fibromyalgia. If you talk to someone and they say, oh, all I had to do was take this special magnesium supplement and my fibromyalgia went away, that to me is not fibromyalgia. That is a magnesium deficiency. And the symptoms are very similar. Same thing with thyroid. Believe it or not, all of the symptoms of low thyroid are exactly the same as fibromyalgia. And if you treat your thyroid and your fibromyalgia goes away, most likely it wasn't fibromyalgia, it was actually a thyroid condition. So fibromyalgia to me is something that is way more complicated. As far as statistics go, I've seen anywhere from 2 to 6% of the population being diagnosed with fibromyalgia. That is several million people. It's a lot. Some estimates say that 80% of these are women. Others say that the ratio is more 2 to 1 women to men. I personally think that it's probably closer to equal. It's just that men tend to not go to the doctor as often, so we're less likely to catch it. Doctors, I think, are less likely to diagnose men with fibromyalgia because it is seen as a woman's disease. So I think there's a lot of factors there that keep us from knowing for sure the ratio from men to women. But assuming the basic statistics that everybody puts out there, let's say 3% of the population, which is conservative, with 80% being women. That means 1 in 21 women have fibromyalgia. If you go with more aggressive statistics, like 6% of the population having fibromyalgia, it could be as many as 1 in 10 or less. So you probably know a lot more people with fibromyalgia than you think you do. And it really does affect a lot of us. In terms of men, we're looking at, again, depending on the statistics, it could be either the same or it could be like 1 in 40, 1 in 80. It's still a lot. Now, here in the United States, where I am, all of those numbers mean that there are anywhere from 6 to 13 million people in the United States with fibromyalgia. And obviously, as a coach, I can't help all of those one-on-one, which is one of the reasons for this podcast, right? I want to come to your house and coach you where you are and see what I can do to help. Now, here's another interesting statistic, and it's might give you an idea for why it can be so challenging to find good help. On a greater scale, there are at least 100 million people in pain here in the United States, and only around 4,700 pain specialists. So you do that math, and it works out to more than 21,000 patients per pain specialist. Obviously, that just doesn't work. It can be why it's so challenging to get help. So what about the history of fibromyalgia? It seems in many circles seems to be sort of a new illness, but it's been around a long time. So in early 1800s, in medical literature, there was a condition that they called muscular rheumatism. That was basically what we're looking at as fibromyalgia today. In 1816, you will find the first full description of fibromyalgia and its symptoms from a doctor from the University of Edinburgh, Dr. William Balfour. I had the chance to go to the University of Edinburgh a year or so ago, and it was super interesting to be there at the old medical school where I assume he practiced and think, this is kind of where it all started. In 1816, 200 years ago, he first described the tender points in fibromyalgia, those spots that if you press on them, it makes you want to shoot through the roof, that a lot of doctors use to diagnose fibromyalgia. Those tender points were described in 1824. So again, almost 200 years ago. There went through a lot of different name changes. In 1976, the name was finally changed to fibromyalgia. So we've had fibromyalgia now for, I don't know, how many, what is that, almost 45 years? Getting close to 50 years. And the diagnostic criteria on how to diagnose fibromyalgia was first outlined in 1990. So a lot of times I will talk to somebody who said that, they've had fibromyalgia since, 1990. And those people I'm always super impressed with because, that was the early stages. They had to have been seeing a very progressive doctor who was very up on their research and their resources to be diagnosed that long ago. So what are the symptoms of fibromyalgia? Like technically, specifically, what are the symptoms that we're looking at when we're being diagnosed? I believe that there are 4 primary symptoms. Now, there's a lot of stuff that can happen because of these, and there's a lot of things that happen with comorbid conditions. Those are other illnesses that you have alongside fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia never comes by itself, right? There's lots of other things that go along. But fibromyalgia itself has 4 primary symptoms. Number 1, the widespread body pain, hurting everywhere for no particular reason. That's a biggie. The second one is unrelenting fatigue. And this is a fatigue that is different than just being tired. I like to use the analogy of, your cell phone where you charge it all day long. It says it's at 100% and then it only lasts an hour. That's the kind of fatigue that we have. And there's reasons for that I will get to. Another symptom, the third symptom, is brain fog. Those of you with fibromyalgia know what I'm talking about. And this is one of the reasons why every podcast episode also has a show notes page. So on fibromyalgiapodcast.com, I will actually list all of the resources that I mentioned, all of the goodies. And because I know, like, brain fog isn't just about forgetting things, it also means having trouble processing. We can have ADD like symptoms with fibromyalgia, and that's all part of this brain fog. And then the fourth one that is very particular to fibromyalgia, if you don't have this, you very likely don't have fibromyalgia, and that is unrefreshing sleep. That's where you sleep all night and you wake up and you're not refreshed. It's as if you didn't sleep at all. Sometimes you even feel worse. That is a hallmark of fibromyalgia. Now, as I said earlier, fibromyalgia never comes by itself. There are usually lots of other things that happen with it, digestive issues, headaches. There's usually thyroid issues, adrenal issues, sleep conditions, all kinds of other stuff. But those four things that I just mentioned, the widespread body pain, the unrelenting fatigue, the cognitive issues or brain fog, and the unrefreshing sleep are the four key symptoms of fibromyalgia. So, how is it diagnosed? For those of you who may not know, I also find that a lot of doctors are really behind on this. So, before 2010, now that was almost 10 years ago now. So 2010, it's now 2019. So 10 years ago, doctors used the tender point exam. There are 18 tender points in the body. There's some on the back of the neck, there's some in the front, some on your elbows, hips, lower back, knees, that when you press on those points, it hurts more than it should. And to diagnose fibromyalgia 10 years ago, back in 2010 and earlier, you had to have 11 out of 18 of those tender points, and you had to have pain in all four quadrants of the body. So that means you had to have pain up both above the waist and below the waist, and you had to have pain on the left side and on the right side. So you couldn't just, for instance, have pain in your legs and be diagnosed with fibromyalgia because that was all lower body. You had to have pain in all four quadrants of your body in order to be diagnosed, and 11 of 10 or 11 of 18 tender points. Now, after 2010, and I have to stop here for a second and just say a lot of doctors and a lot of people still think we're using the 2010 diagnostic criteria. A lot of people are still thinking you have to have 11 tender points. A lot of people are thinking you have to have pain in all four quadrants. That has not been the case for almost 10 years now. So we need to get up to date, both our doctors and us as patients. So since 2010, the diagnostic criteria looks at your pain and your symptoms over the last week. Yes, it does look at the number of tender points that you have, but it's also looking at the severity of your fatigue, whether you wake up feeling refreshed or not. It's also looking at your cognitive problems, so your memory and your ability to think, and looking at other general symptoms. It's also looking to see whether or not these symptoms have lasted for at least 3 months at a similar level. So, for instance, if you had a car accident last week, maybe you meet all these criteria, but you've only had it's only been a week. That wouldn't qualify you as having fibromyalgia. But if you had that accident, you had all these symptoms, it was a year ago, it's been the same for at least 3 months, that would qualify you as having fibromyalgia. The other aspect is really making sure that there is no other health problem that would explain the pain or explain the symptoms. So, as I mentioned earlier, things like a magnesium deficiency or a thyroid condition or lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, all of these other things, just really making sure that we can't explain this in some other way. There have been some doctors lately, even more recent than 2010, who are saying, you can have one tender point and have fibromyalgia. There are some doctors who are saying we can just have you fill out this questionnaire and be able to diagnose you with fibromyalgia. There is also a fibromyalgia blood test that has been around since 2013, I believe. I know I talked about it in my first book, and it had been around a while at that point. So I think it came out in 2013. And you can find information on that at the fibromyalgiatest.com. And we will include all of these links again in the show notes so you can go take a look at that. The fibromyalgia test, the FM test, is being covered by some insurance, not all. I have had some clients where it was covered and some clients where it wasn't. It can be expensive if it's not covered. And it's looking at particular immune system markers in your blood to see if you have fibromyalgia or not. It's supposed to be as accurate as the tests for things like HIV, but it's only been around for about 6 years. So, it's only been used on a limited basis. So we won't really know the accuracy of this until it's a little bit more widely used and has been used for longer. So it's still something that's encouraging and something to definitely check out. Now, with fibromyalgia, there's actually a lot of science. A lot of those researchers that I was mentioning feeling around the elephant to see their particular part of it. So here are some of the bits of science that I particularly find interesting. Now, remember, this is not a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination. These are just the things that I personally find particularly interesting and want to share with you. Number one is that there was a study done a while back looking at fibromyalgia versus chronic fatigue syndrome and looking at mitochondrial dysfunction. So for those of you who don't know, your mitochondria are your little power cells in each of the cells of your body. It's like the little batteries inside your cells. And these little batteries take the energy that we bring in other words, the food that we eat, and turn it into energy that our bodies can run on. So in these mitochondria and these tiny little batteries inside of our cells, with fibromyalgia, they are finding that there is less ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, and this is the energy your body runs on. So there's literally less energy in your batteries. Remember, I was talking about that cell phone that you charge all day and then it only lasts an hour. That is literally what our bodies are like. Our little batteries get fully charged, but they don't hold as much. There's less ATP in there. There's less CoQ10. Coenzyme Q10, which is used by your body in this process of converting fuel to usable energy, converting food to energy. There's less mitochondrial DNA, and there's been some studies that have shown mitochondrial dysfunction even in the skin of fibromyalgia patients. Now, the thing I find super, super interesting about this is that when they were comparing fibromyalgia to chronic fatigue syndrome, there was actually more things wrong in fibromyalgia than there was in the chronic fatigue patients. So even though we're talking about energy here, and the hallmark of chronic fatigue syndrome is fatigue, they actually had more things that showed up as normal than we did in fibromyalgia. So it's also an indicator that maybe fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue are two separate illnesses, and not a continuum of the same illness like some people suggest. It kind of implies that maybe we're talking about two different things because there's differences between the two illnesses in the study. Another bit of study that I find super interesting is that fibromyalgia is really a central nervous system disorder. What they have found is that fibromyalgia patients actually process pain differently. And what I mean by that is, for instance, if you squeeze the thumb of a patient with fibromyalgia, so you squeeze it with a certain amount of pressure, we will actually experience twice as much pain as someone without fibromyalgia at the same amount of pressure. So it's like we have a 2 times pain response. So let's say we use just generic units and say we give a pressure of 1 to us with fibromyalgia, it feels like 2, where someone who doesn't have fibromyalgia, it would still just feel like 1. So if you ever feel like, oh my gosh, my pain response is like not normal, you're right. We do have a different pain response. The other thing that's super interesting is they did functional MRIs, which is where they do an MRI, not just a static MRI, like taking a picture like a photograph. It's a functional MRI is where you're actually like doing things while they're watching your brain. So it's a little bit more like taking a video instead of a snapshot. And when they would um, give the fibromyalgia patient some kind of stimulus, painful stimulus, more areas of the brain light up in fibromyalgia than light up in somebody who does not have fibromyalgia. So literally, our brains experience pain in a different way. There are more areas of the brain that light up. More of our brain is experiencing that pain. Super, super interesting to me. One study found that there were extra nerve endings in the hands of fibromyalgia patients. They found that these nerve endings actually control blood flow. And the idea is that those nerve endings are not managing blood flow properly, which means that blood flow is not getting to our muscles properly, which could be causing the muscle aches, not getting to our brains properly, which means we don't think as well. And so there is one theory that this is part of the problem. There was another pilot study that showed that small fiber neuropathy was present in about half of the fibromyalgia patients that they looked at. Small fiber neuropathy is where your small peripheral nerves, like in your hands and your feet, just are experiencing degeneration, pain, lots of different things. That's where you might be feeling tingling or burning sensations. And one study showed that at least half of the fibro patients they looked at had small fiber neuropathy, and they're thinking that this may be the thing that's causing the pain. Now, I believe that you can have both. I have one client who was diagnosed with small fiber neuropathy and fibromyalgia both. So you can have both things. One can lead to another, but there is some things going on nerve-wise. Another study I find particularly interesting because I fit into these demographics is a clinic took all of their fibromyalgia patients, and as they were coming in, they did x-rays on their necks just to see how their necks looked. And they found that 90% of their fibromyalgia patients had either a straight neck or their neck curved the wrong direction. Now, if you don't know, your neck should have a little bit of a curve, and that sort of keeps your head on a little bit of a spring. So when you're walking or running or just, living life, there's a little bit of cushion there to kind of protect your brain and keep your body happy. If you have a straight neck, it's a little bit more like being on a pogo stick. There's no curve, there's no give, and it can definitely cause more headaches and things like that when you have a straight neck. So there seems to be some things going on with the neck, nerve impingement, pinching your spinal cord that comes down. Your very top vertebrae, your brain actually comes down inside of it a little bit. And if your top vertebrae isn't aligned correctly, you can actually be squeezing your brain, which causes headaches and all kinds of other symptoms, dizziness and things like that. So there seems to be something going on in the neck. We also know that there's immune system issues, like our system is getting stuck. Have you ever had a computer where you were loading a program and it got to like 80% and then it just like sat there for hours and never finished? It's our immune system can kind of be like that, where our repair system gets stuck and never really finishes. There's some things like that they have found with fibromyalgia. Now, it's also super interesting when you start looking at sleep in fibromyalgia. Some people consider fibromyalgia to be a sleep disorder. There's one expert who says that he can diagnose fibromyalgia simply by looking at people's brain waves when they sleep. There was a study done. Now, this study was actually looking at sleep, not looking at fibromyalgia. And they took healthy college students and they kept them from getting into the deeper levels of sleep. So as they would start to get into the deep levels of sleep, they would play music, wake them up, and then let them keep sleeping. And after not very many days, those college students started experiencing body pain and brain fog and fatigue like you wouldn't believe. Basically started experiencing fibromyalgia symptoms. So there is a lot with fibromyalgia and sleep. We have these awake brain waves that intrude on our sleep brain waves. They call it alpha delta brain waves because the awake brain waves are showing up when you should be having slow delta sleep waves. We also kind of get stuck in fight or flight. It's like our bodies are looking out for saber-toothed tigers the whole time, and not getting into the deep levels of sleep, like we're sleeping with one eye open all night long. So there's definitely sleep stuff going on with fibromyalgia. There's lots of digestive stuff. There have been some interesting theories about leaky gut or the microbiome, the bacteria that you have in your guts that help help digest the food, keep it moving along, keep your body healthy and happy. And they've even done, believe it or not, fecal transplants. And that really is what you think it is, taking somebody else's poop and using it as an enema to replant healthy bacteria into a new person's body, where that has actually reversed some symptoms. Super interesting. There was also a study in Israel that has been repeated in other places where they took fibromyalgia patients and put them into a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. If you're not familiar with what that is, it's what they use when divers go diving. If they come up too fast, they put them in this hyperbaric oxygen chamber. And it's basically an oxygen chamber with pressure so that it is pushing that oxygen deep down into your cells. They took fibromyalgia patients, gave them 40 hyperbaric oxygen chamber sessions in a month. So 40 sessions, that math doesn't work out. 20 sessions. It was 5 days a week for 4 weeks. So 20 sessions in 30 days. And some of those patients at the end of those 30 days actually no longer qualified as having fibromyalgia, which I think is super fascinating. So this idea that maybe our bodies aren't getting the oxygen that they need. The sad thing about this study that was done is that they didn't follow those patients. So we don't know what happened. We don't know if that totally reversed their fibromyalgia and they never had symptoms again, which I would suspect is probably not true, but we don't know. We don't know. What I expect is that they had a remission of their symptoms, and then they would need to keep up those oxygen treatments however often to maintain that. Like, I think there's actually something where our bodies don't work properly, and just 20 sessions in 30 days isn't going to reverse, isn't going to totally change how our body functions. But there might be some kind of a maintenance plan that you might be able to do to keep up those things. But again, we don't know because they didn't follow those patients. I have heard through the doctors and researchers I know that they are redoing that study, where they will be following the patients to see what happens at the end of those 30 days, what happens a year afterwards, for instance. There's lots of other things too, with hormones and nutrition and neurotransmitters and other conditions that happen with fibromyalgia. Lots and lots of science. So fibromyalgia, if you haven't caught this by now, fibromyalgia is definitely not all in your head, except from the standpoint of the fact that really everything is all in your head, because if you didn't have a brain, like, you wouldn't exist. And the fact that our brains actually do process things differently. So if somebody ever tells you fibromyalgia is all in your head, you can say, yes, it is. My brain actually doesn't work right. So that is just kind of my overview of what I believe fibromyalgia is and some of the science that I find super fascinating. And in our next episode, I have invited Dr. Ginevra Lipton to come share her perspective on what fibromyalgia is. She is the author of the Fibro Manual. She is the medical director of the Frida Center for Fibromyalgia, and she has done some research with Oregon Health and Science University on fibromyalgia and some of these interesting things that we have been talking about. So I hope you will join us again and hear her perspective. And in the upcoming weeks, we will also be talking about fun things like some of the research behind coaching, how a fibromyalgia coach can help, self-care, and some other goodies. So remember, all of the things that I mentioned, this episode in particular is going to have a lot of stuff out on the show notes page. I'm going to link to a lot of those studies that I mentioned. So for those of you who are really interested in the science and in digging into the background of this, we will have links to those studies on the show notes page. So just go to fibromyalgiapodcast.com and you will find all of those details. You should be able to go to fibromyalgiapodcast.com/4 for episode 4 to get today's show notes. See you next time.